Yes, Mr. Stewart.
Your Honour, I recall Father John Walsh. I also hand up, Your Honour, a small bundle of documents being a selection of emails and their attachments.
Are you tendering them?
And I tendered them, yes.
The documents will be exhibit 28, 121. Father, you remain on your oath to tell the truth. You understand that? Yes, Mr. Stewart.
Father, are you aware that yesterday afternoon the solicitors acting for Cardinal Pell produced under a summons some documents consisting mostly of emails and also some draft statements to the Royal Commission?
Yes.
Concerning your evidence?
Yes.
Yes. And have you had the opportunity to look at those emails and drafts?
Yes.
And did you look at those this morning, I suppose?
Last evening, not this morning.
Right, yesterday evening. Thank you. So the position is correct, isn't it, that Mr. Duggan, barrister representing Cardinal Pell, spoke to you on the telephone on the afternoon of Friday, the 4th of December, in which you gave a recollection of your events. Is that right?
I don't believe it was Mr. Duggan, it was Mr. De Rosario.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you that. Do you know who else was on the telephone call?
No, I don't.
So it was a call between Mr. Desario and you don't know if anyone else was on the call?
I don't know, no.
Yes. Yes. Well, if you have a look at the email, which is page 1 of Exhibit 28121 that I've handed up. You'll see that Mr. Duggan says to Mr. De Rosario in an email at 4:26 on that day, "Dear Michael, Father Walsh spoke very quickly, but these are my notes." That seems to suggest, well, it does suggest that Mr. Duggan was on the phone call and heard you speaking, and these are his notes of you having spoken. Do you see that?
I see that, yes.
Do you not know whether he was on the call?
I cannot recall it speaking to Mr. Duggan, but
Yes.
It was such a flurry of calls back and forth, I didn't... If I did, I don't recall it. I thought I was all the time dealing with Mr. De Rosario.
Yes.
Father, can you make sure that microphone picks you up? Thank you.
Now, following that call, a draft statement was then sent to you, is that right?
Yes, so I spoke with Mr. De Rosario, and I think he was obviously taking notes, and then he sent me back a draft statement.
Well, you don't know one way or the other whether he was taking notes, I take it?
Oh, well, I wasn't there, no, I don't know that.
Yes, exactly. It may have been Mr. Duggan who was taking notes, as this email suggests.
He may have.
Yes, so confining yourself to the things you actually know, Father, there was a phone call on the Friday afternoon in which Mr. De Rosario was on the call with you, right?
Yes.
You don't know who else, if anyone else, was also on the call?
I don't know that.
Yes. And later that evening, Mr. De Rosario sent you a draft statement.
He sent me a draft statement and also the accompanying statement of David Ridsdale.
Yes. And the next day, at about midday, you sent an email back in which you made some comments and suggested some things that needed to change. Is that right?
That's correct.
And later that day, at about 3:30, that's the Saturday, you had a further telephone conversation with Mr. De Rosario about the content of your statement. And later that day, at about 3:30, that's the Saturday, you had a further telephone conversation. Were the only two calls, as I understand it, telephone calls with the lawyers representing Cardinal Pell, in which you discussed the content of your statement.
That's correct.
Yes. There were obviously other calls about when you were going to give evidence and arranging for how they were going to get the statement from you and so on.
Of calls about serving of summons and those questions.
Yes, but on the content of the statement, there was the one on the Friday afternoon and there was the one on the Saturday afternoon.
That's correct.
Yes. And when you were spoken to in the call on the Friday afternoon, that, as I understand it, was your first unprompted opportunity to state your recollection of the events as to Cardinal Pell's conversation with David Ridsdale since you had spoken to the Cardinal about it in 2002.
That's correct.
Yes, now, taking a look at Mr. Duggan's notes of what you said, taking a look at Mr. Duggan's notes of open communication - good friends, do you see that?
Yes.
So you told Mr. De Rosario that you and Cardinal Pell were good friends, is that right?
That's correct.
And that's true, of course.
That's true. That's true.
Yes. And he asked you, or you were asked on the telephone call, whether you had any recollection of Cardinal Pell speaking with David Ridsdale. And you see the line, it's 2 below the one where it said good friends. Recollection of speaking.
I think it's, the note is David Ridsdale's search rang Cardinal Pell on the 2nd of February. The date's important, I think, isn't it?
Yes. Well, there's a date put in there. You see that, 2nd of February?
I do.
And then, am I to understand, you were asked, do you have a recollection of speaking to GP, that's George Pell, about David Ridsdale? Is that right?
That's correct.
Well, it's recorded as Ridsdale, but in the context of the previous line referring to David Ridsdale asserts, we to understand that you were asked whether you had a recollection of speaking to George Pell about David Ridsdale. Is that right?
That's correct.
You weren't asked about the recollection of speaking to George Pell about David Ridsdale. Is that right?
That's correct.
You weren't asked about whether you had a recollection of George. You did not say that you had a strong recollection. Not
at that stage, no.
Yes. And that's because your recollection was vague, is that right?
At that time, I hadn't.
You had a strong recollection.
Not at that stage, no.
Yes. And that's because your recollection was vague, is that right?
At that time, I hadn't thought about the matter until I was asked then, and that's why then I had to go back and think carefully over matters to what I could recall.
Yes. You racked your brain, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. We'll come back to that. You said at that time...
Please stand by. Attention, attention. This is the Chief's warden. A fire alarm has been activated. Level 9 is required to evacuate. All other levels, please stand by.
Father, you'll see Mr. Duggan's notes 2 lines later say, speak about Ridsdale and say he had even abused his nephew. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then it's recorded early evening, usually out doing parish works. Now, am I to understand that in that call, you said that you had a recollection of something having happened in the early evening, is that right?
That's correct.
And what is it that happened in the early evening?
What I believe had happened is I conflated 2 events, namely the watching of the television of the Cardinal, the Bishop accompanying Gerard Ridsdale to court, and the phone call. And then until I sat down and tried to work through things, it's then that I realised that it was a morning call, the phone, and the evening was the watching of the television program.
So I take it when you were first asked about this, you didn't remember a morning call?
No, I didn't. There was no real talk about timing, I don't think so much. I didn't focus on that.
Didn't remember a morning call?
No, I didn't. There was no real talk about timing, I don't think so much. I didn't focus on that.
Well, you talked about the evening.
Not then.
No.
And you see a bit further, you say that you were asked whether you were in the house when the call was made. Do you see that?
Which line is that? That's
In house when call made, question mark?
Attention, attention. This is the Chief Warden.